there's a strange little trend that has been growing louder in comment sections and true crime forums. People line up Dexter Morgan beside Charles Manson and talk about them as if they belong in the same category. As if a fictional vigilante from a premium cable series and a real-world cult leader from Spawn Ranch are just two versions of the same dark archetype. On the surface, it makes a kind of intuitive sense. Both are framed as men with lethal charisma, hidden urges, and a talent for moving through the world unnoticed. Dexter walks into Miami Metro Homicide every morning with a smile and a box of donuts. Manson strums a guitar at the ranch, preaching about revolution to followers who hang on every word. Two masks, two shadows, one tempting comparison. But that is not the whole story, because when you lay them all out together, their motives, their methods, their psychology, their consequences, you start to see that this is more than just an apples to oranges problem. It is a comparison that quietly blurs the line between entertainment and historical atrocity, between a constructed narrative about controlled killing and the grim, chaotic reality of the Tate LaBianca murders. So, in this video, we're going to slow everything down. This is the story of a fictional killer with a code and a real cult leader with an ideology, and why putting them side by side without care is not just inaccurate, but ethically risky. The pace here will be calm and deliberate, the way Dexter moves through a crime scene, not the way Manson's followers stumbled through bloody houses in a haze of drugs, fear, and confusion. We are going to walk step by step through Dexter's ritualized discipline, the plastic, the tools, the meticulous cleanup, the constant awareness that Miami Metro Homicide is right down the hall, and set it against Manson's manipulation, his apocalyptic rhetoric, and his chaotic control over people who actually carried out the stabbing, the shooting, the carving. One man's danger lives in the fantasy of precision. The other's horror lives in the reality of influence. Along the way, we will keep coming back to the stakes. How we talk about killers matters. Media that glamorizes a kind of neat, almost bloodless justice can quietly shape how you think about responsibility, about who deserves what, about who you are allowed to secretly root for when the lights are off, and the episode keeps playing. We will also be tracing two very different paths to exposure. Dexter almost getting caught through forensic slip-ups, emotional attachments, and colleagues who notice just a little too much of the whole series. Dexter doesn't stalk random strangers. He conducts investigations that mirror official police work, checks evidence, tests whether his target fits the code of Harry. And that code is presented as a kind of moral firewall, a set of rules that takes his compulsion and routes it towards something the story can frame as necessary, even almost heroic. The violence is still there, but the filter makes it feel organized, purposeful, controlled. The show then pulls you directly into his head. You do not watch Dexter from a distance. You ride along inside his internal monologue. His voiceover dissects every moment, every mask he puts on, every line he crosses or carefully avoids. We hear him classify emotions, analyze colleagues, narrate his own lack of feeling with the same clinical tone he uses on a bloodstain. You start to see the world the way he does, as a series of puzzles to be solved and threats to be contained. And in that world, his kills are almost ritualistically clean. Plastic sheeting erases mess. The ocean swallows bodies. Crime scenes vanish as if Miami itself is collaborating with him. Again and again. Improbable timing saves his double life. Someone knocks at the door, 1 second too late. A piece of evidence burns. A witness changes their mind. When you lay them all out together, the pattern is obvious. This is not probability. This is design. The series leans into that design with every near capture. A drop of blood on a boat, a security camera, a colleague who looks twice at the wrong moment. Each time, the suspense tightens, but the fantasy holds. The mask almost slips, but the code of Harry, a hasty improvisation or sheer narrative luck, snaps it back into place. It is a carefully tuned anxiety. Enough danger to keep you alert, never enough to truly shatter the illusion that Dexter can keep doing this. Real violence does not work like this. Real investigations do not orbit one gifted analyst whose secrets stay buried because the story needs another season. Dexter is a stylized, almost meditative puzzle box where you can safely explore dark impulses without having to sit with the genuine chaos that follows real blood on real floors. Comparing that to Charles Manson is like comparing a haunted house attraction to an actual war zone. To understand why the comparison fails, we have to step out of the TV glow and into Manson's world, where control breaks down, where the violence is messy, panicked, and refuses to stay on the screen. So we are going to leave Dexter's neatly wrapped kill rooms behind for a moment and walk out into late 1960s California, where nothing is color graded and no one is in control. Settle in, get comfortable, because this is the people sleep on floors, in shacks, in broken down vehicles. There is no mask to maintain, because there is no respectable day life to contrast with the night, and threaded through that environment is constant intoxication. LSD, amphetamines, marijuana, whatever they can get or trade for. Nights blur into days. Manson rants about the coming apocalypse, race war, the Beatles, hidden messages only he can decode. His followers cycle between fear, devotion, and chemical confusion. This is not Dexter's clinical headspace, where every movement is measured and every moment is logged. It is a haze, and inside that haze, people become tools. When the murders come, they reflect that haze. The Tate and LaBianca killings are not surgical operations executed by a solitary predator. They are group invasions, multiple perpetrators, improvised weapons, frantic stabbings, begging, screaming, blood on walls, and panicked flights back to the ranch. The crime scenes are chaotic, overflowing with physical evidence and conflicting motives. Nothing is clean, nothing is contained. Manson himself does not plunge the knives in those most infamous attacks. His violence is outsourced. His power sits in manipulation, in ideology, in the slow grinding down of other people's boundaries until they will carry out what he only suggests. Dexter's danger lives in his own hands. Manson's danger lives in the hands of others who no longer trust their own minds. And that is where the terror shifts. Dexter plans, rehearses, checks the tide charts. Manson lets things spin. The unpredictability is the point. When you lay them all out together, the ranch, the drugs, the rambling prophecies, the confused motives, the sloppy follow-through, you start to see how far this is from the sleek, solitary predator image that television so often sells. If Dexter is about one man trying to impose order on his darkness, Manson is about a man teaching other people to unleash theirs. That is the line where the comparison does not just bend, it breaks. And on the other side of that break is the question we have to face next. What happens when real-world chaos gets pulled back into the tidy logic of a show like Dexter? To answer that, we're going to move inside both of their heads for a moment and look at the machinery, not the headlines, not the mythology, but the operating systems running underneath. Dexter Morgan lives by something very specific, the Code of Harry. You hear it referenced across the series, but when you lay them all out together, the rules form a closed circuit. Only kill people who have killed and will kill again. Confirm their guilt with evidence, not just intuition. Leave nothing behind that Miami Metro homicide confirms. The body disappears into the ocean. The blood goes down the drain. The slides go into a hidden box. Every moment is premeditated, rehearsed, scrubbed of randomness, as if randomness itself were evidence. Now, let's put that next to Charles Manson. There is no Code of Harry at Spahn Ranch. There is no forensic discipline, no awareness of what a fingerprint on a doorknob or a bloody shoe print on a porch can do in a courtroom. Instead, you get a shifting cloud of ideas, helter-skelter, racial apocalypse, personal grudges against imagined enemies in Hollywood. His rules arrive through rambling speeches and drug-fueled nights, mutating as his mood changes. Where Dexter turns his chaos inward and builds walls around it, Manson pushes his outward. His power comes from dissolving the boundaries of his followers' identities until they will carry out savage, messy crimes on his behalf. The Tate LaBianca scenes are the opposite of a plastic-wrapped kill room. Blood everywhere, words smeared on walls, witnesses who can talk, evidence that accumulates until the case closes in. He is not mastering his impulses. He is infecting other people with them. And when you lay them all out together, Dexter's internal code versus Manson's externalized ideology, you start to see the gap. One system is about control. The other is about contagion. That difference does not just change how they move through the world. It changes how they almost, or actually, get caught, which is where we need to go next. And that gap is exactly why our brains keep trying to close it. Because on the surface, Dexter and Manson feel like they belong in the same mental folder. Both are tied to murder. Both have a kind of charisma that pulls people in. Both live in stories that invite obsessive analysis. Whether it is a prestige TV series you rewatch every season, or a true crime case you fall asleep listening to in documentary form, it feels efficient to put them on the same shelf. We are going to notice how culture helps with that. True crime and prestige television have slowly blurred the line between real and fictional killers in our collective imagination. You watch Morgan move through Miami Metro homicide with his quiet charm, then you flip to a documentary that edits Manson's courtroom rants like a character study. The lighting, the music, the talking heads, the slow zooms on crime scene photos and blood spatter all start to rhyme. The forms match, so the figures feel like they belong in the same comparison. So people start using Manson as a benchmark, a kind of measuring stick for how bad Dexter really is. You hear questions like, is Dexter worse than Manson? As if there is a single shared scale where you can comparable figures instead of fundamentally different categories. And that impulse is not inherently malicious. When we talk about Morgan's code next to Manson's ideology, we are really trying to feel out the boundaries of empathy, justice, and punishment. We use stories to test how far our compassion stretches, where it snaps, and what it means to call someone irredeemable. But when you lay them all out together, fictional vigilante fantasy and real-world cult atrocity, you start to see the cost of that single spectrum. It quietly normalizes the real violence by framing it as just another entry in a shared ranking. So, settle in, get comfortable, because the rest of this breakdown is going to give us more precise language. Instead of flattening Dexter and Manson into the same category, we are going to separate the scales they live on and trace how each one really works. To do that, we are going to step inside Dexter's inner lab for a minute and stay there. This is the story of a man who treats his own mind like a crime scene and his own urges like evidence that has to be cataloged, contained, and never allowed to leak. From the very beginning of the series, Dexter names that urge the dark passenger. It is not just a poetic flourish. It is the show's central metaphor for his homicidal drive, something he experiences as an internal presence riding along with him in every moment. When he walks into Miami Metro Homicide with donuts and a smile, the passenger is there. When he stands over a bound victim in a plastic-wrapped room, the passenger steps forward. The metaphor lets him split himself in two, as if the part that kills is a separate entity that must be managed rather than simply who Dexter Morgan is. The origin of that split is not subtle. Young Dexter, sitting in a pool of his mother's blood, listening to the sound of a chainsaw and her screams, is one of the most repeated images in the series. The show keeps returning to it because, in its internal logic, that trauma is the seed. You start to see his compulsion framed as almost inevitable, not a choice so much as a consequence. Harry doesn't discover a boy who might become violent. He discovers a boy who, the narrative suggests, already carries violence as a permanent stain. That is where the code of Harry comes in. The code is a leash, but it is also a mirror that flatters him. On the surface, it is pure control. Only kill those who have killed and will kill again. Leave no evidence. Blend in. Underneath, it is a justification machine. It gives structure to the dark passenger while quietly telling Dexter that he is not a monster. He is a necessary predator. Every plastic sheet, every slide of blood, every careful ritual becomes both a safety protocol and a sermon he preaches to himself. And because inwardly anchored about his private negotiations with his own urges and his own code, not about recruiting anyone else into that worldview. And that is where the contrast with Manson begins to sharpen, because Manson is almost the opposite. A man who takes his storm, pushes it outward into other people, and then stands back to watch what they do with it. Manson's storm does not stay inside his own skull. It spills outward, looking for cracks in other people. He is not a careful technician of his own urges. He is a chronic manipulator who learns, over years, in and out of prison, how to read a room, how to feel for soft spots, how to sense who needs approval, who fears abandonment, who is already halfway to surrender. This is the story of a man who almost never works alone, not because he values connection the way Dexter sometimes does, but because control becomes his preferred weapon. Manson's long criminal history is less about spectacular heists and more about practice runs and domination, petty theft, pimping, institutional time, where he studies how authority talks, how punishment lands, how you can break someone down simply by deciding what they're allowed to hope for. By the time he reaches Spawn Ranch, he has a script. At the ranch, we're going to see that script play out as a kind of outer laboratory. He isolates followers from their previous lives, encourages them to cut ties with family, strips away names, routines, and any identity that does not pass through him first. In that vacuum, he positions himself as a spiritual authority, part guru, part prophet, part failed musician, promising that the universe has a secret role reserved for this little group on a dusty California property. Ideology becomes the scaffolding that holds the manipulation in place. Manson's distorted readings of the Beatles, especially Helter Skelter, turn pop culture into scripture. A coming race war, an apocalyptic cleansing, a story where the family will descend into a bottomless pit and emerge as rulers. These are not carefully reasoned beliefs. They are flexible tools of control. When followers hesitate, the prophecy shifts. When violence escalates, the story expands to justify it. And crucially, the violence itself is mostly borrowed. Manson talks, suggests, rehearses, sends people out. He primes them with drugs, with repetition, with late-night monologues about inevitability and destiny. At the Tate and La Bianca houses, it is his followers who wield the knives and guns, who leave chaotic, bloody crime scenes that look nothing like Dexter Morgan's plastic-wrapped precision. Manson stands at one remove, but he is not distant. He is in their heads. The lab he runs is messy. Heavy drug use blurs memory and judgment. Group dynamic, deliberate threat. Over 8 seasons and a return to New Blood, we're going to watch the same pattern repeat. A tiny fracture in the mask, the sense of the room getting smaller, and then a carefully engineered escape that restores the illusion until it doesn't. This is the story of almost being caught. One of the main engines keeping you with Dexter, episode after episode, is that cycle of mistake, pressure, and relief. A missing blood slide from his trophy box, an overlooked security camera in a marina, an unexpected witness who remembers the wrong car at the wrong time, a body that surfaces where it absolutely should not be. Drifting too close to Miami Metro homicide, too close to his day job. Every season finds a new variation on the same quiet nightmare. A lab tech notices a discrepancy in a report. A boat registration list suddenly matters because the Bay Harbor butcher is tied to specific algae. A CCTV angle catches Dexter's car near a dump site. None of these are spectacular blunders. They are the small, plausible oversights that any forensically trained killer would fear, and the show lingers on every moment when he realizes what he missed. Around him, institutional pressure builds like weather. Colleagues start to get suspicious in ways that are professional first and personal second. Task forces form around killers he knows more about than he can safely admit. Higher-ups demand results on cases he is secretly sabotaging or cleaning up. Miami Metro becomes both workplace and trap, a building full of people paid to notice patterns, standing inches away from the one pattern that matters most. Dexter's response is never panicked improvisation. It is methodical. He revisits crime scenes under the pretense of follow-up analysis. He rechecks evidence logs and chain of custody forms. He uses his forensic knowledge to anticipate exactly how investigators will think, where they will look, what they will assume from a blood drop here, or a missing report there. Let's be clear. The tension is not whether he understands the system, but whether he can stay one step ahead of it. The suspense is highly controlled. You are meant to feel he could be caught at any moment, while also trusting that the narrative will protect him right up until the structure finally allows that protection to fail. When you lay them all out together, you start to see that these near captures are puzzles more than probabilities, designed to showcase Dexter's intelligence, and the thin line he walks rather than to simulate real investigative chaos. Settle in, get comfortable with that pattern, because it is part of the fantasy. Dexter lets you flirt with consequences without ever fully entering the grinding confusion of an actual case file, of an investigation that begins not with a profile, but with fear, politics, and pressure from every direction to make sense of something that does not want to make sense. And for a while, they fail. Separate squads work the Tate and LaBianca murders as if they might be unrelated. Leads spin out, stall, and die. Evidence is collected, misinterpreted, sometimes mishandled. There is no Dexter Morgan walking in to calmly read the blood and deliver a unifying theory. There are just overworked detectives, inconsistent witness memories, and a crime scene so saturated in violence that it almost obscures itself. What starts to crack it is not a single flash of insight. It is people talking. Manson's followers are not disciplined acolytes. They are unstable, drug-soaked liabilities. Some brag at parties about creepy crawls. Others end up in county jails on unrelated charges and start telling stories to cellmates. One follower confides in a boyfriend, another in a probation officer. Those people, on the periphery of the family, become informants almost by accident. When you lay them all out together, you start to see how unglamorous it really is. A jailhouse rumor here, a frightened runaway there, a girl who suddenly wants out and is willing to trade information. Witness testimony does not arrive as a pristine monologue. It drips in over weeks and months, half-remembered, self-serving, contaminated by fear and ego. Physical evidence matters, but again, not in a cinematic way. There are bloody prints, fibers, handwriting comparisons, stolen property tying back to the ranch. Some of it is found because someone finally looks in the right box. Some of it is matched only after jurisdictions compare notes they should have shared earlier. Chance, human error, and bureaucratic overlap are doing as much work as forensics. Underneath all of this is Manson's fundamental problem: control that only works until it is tested. The more people he involves, the more variables he creates. Every follower is another potential confession, another panic, another betrayal. His web does not get outwitted in a single dramatic twist. It collapses under its own weight, strand by sloppy strand. And if we hold that next to Dexter, the contrast sharpens. In the series, the investigation is almost a dance partner for Morgan, circling him, reflecting him, giving him clean lines to react against. Manson is nothing like that. He is one unstable node inside a much larger, uglier reality where cases move unevenly for the most human and least cinematic reasons. Settle in, get comfortable, because as we keep going, we're going to see just how far that gap really is between the fantasy of the perfect predator, cheating, catches the reflection of light in a droplet, pauses on the photo collage of prior victims that Dexter shows his target. Violence becomes a kind of visual puzzle. You are not just watching a throat being cut. You are decoding symbols, textures, patterns that invite you to think rather than recoil. But that is not what the Manson murders looked like. The accounts from Cielo Drive and the LaBianca house describe something closer to a stampede in a locked room. Multiple attackers moving through dark hallways and open yards, high on drugs, shouting, slipping in their own footprints. Terrified victims, running, pleading, fighting back. Dozens of stab wounds, blunt force injuries, messages smeared on walls and doors with blood that was already beginning to dry. Real crime scene photos from that era, where they still circulate, are almost unwatchable, not because they are clever, but because they are not. The composition is accidental. Bodies are where they fell. Furniture is overturned, lamps broken, glass scattered, in places no director would have chosen. You start to see how far stylized TV violence is from the blunt, exhausting reality that investigators walked into the next morning. Dexter's world, by contrast, is built to be watchable. The score swells at the right moment, then drops out to let you hear a single breath. The framing keeps the worst of the gore just off-center, so you feel the impact without being forced into genuine revulsion. This is the story of a killer whose rituals are designed, quite literally, for an audience. Manson's killings were not. They were acts of terror and confusion, improvised by followers who were trying to impress a man who was not even in the room. What they left behind was trauma, grief, and years of legal and emotional fallout, not narrative satisfaction. When you lay them all out together, clean plastic versus smeared walls, curated stillness versus frantic motion, we are going to feel how dangerous it is to let the aesthetics of fictional killing bleed into how we think about real murder. And that aesthetic gap does not just shape what we can stand to look at. It feeds directly into how we judge the ethics of someone like Dexter next to someone like Manson, which is where we are headed next. And that aesthetic gap opens a door the series quietly invites you to walk through. Because once killing looks controlled and almost elegant, it becomes much easier to sell you on the idea that some deaths feel not only tolerable, but necessary. Dexter's world is built to make that step feel natural. The writers do not start him with ambiguous targets. They give you child killers, rapists, human traffickers, serial predators who stalk Miami nights the way he does. Corrupt lawyers who bury key witnesses. Overwhelmed detectives triaging cases because there are too many bodies and not enough time. The line is clear. Institutional justice is well-intentioned, but porous. People slip through. The series-wide story of Miami Metro is not that they are indifferent. It is that they are human, constrained, and sometimes easily misled. Dexter steps directly into that gap. He offers a fantasy of justice that is immediate, precise, and permanent. No appeals, no plea bargains, no doubt. On his table, the killer confesses, the photos come out, the blood slide is taken, and then the body disappears into the ocean. The narrative treats Dexter as someone who simply knows they are guilty, as if his code and his forensic discipline were a more reliable safeguard than any jury. So when you feel relief as he kills, the show has already done the work. It frames each death as the system being quietly corrected rather than broken further. No innocent casualties, no messy raids, just a single, highly competent killer doing what the law cannot, and somehow leaving every bystander untouched. When you lay them all out together, the evil victims, the failed systems, the clean executions, you start to see how Dexter justice becomes a comforting story rather than a realistic moral framework. Settle in. Get comfortable with that feeling for a moment, because the instant you bring Charles Manson into the same frame, that comfort collides with the real-world horror of charismatic violence, and the comparison stops looking clever and starts looking deeply unsettling. So, when that comfort collides with Charles Manson, we're going to slow down and look very closely at what people mean when they call him charismatic. On the surface, it sounds like the same quality that makes Dexter Morgan compelling to watch. A dangerous man with a magnetic presence. A figure who holds a room in absolute focus. But that is not what Manson's charisma was. Not in any way that should feel entertaining. His pull worked on people who were already drifting at the edges. Young runaways, kids estranged from their families, people spun out on drugs and searching for some kind of meaning in the middle of the 1960s. He did not walk into a crowded Miami Metro homicide briefing and win over a room of skeptical professionals. He found the people least able to say no and made sure they never wanted to. The method was not stylish menace or witty one-liners. It was love bombing, endless attention, music, drugs, sex, and the promise that you were finally seen, finally special, finally part of a story larger than yourself. Then came the other half, sleep deprivation, humiliation into a circus. All of that played one function: control, chaos, and self-mythologizing. He wanted investigators, jurors, the press, and his own followers to orbit the idea of Charles Manson as something larger than a man who sent other people to do random, horrifying things. And those consequences were not carefully selected targets. The Tate LaBianca murders were messy, disorganized, and brutally ordinary in their victims. A pregnant actress, her friends, a couple in their home. No code, no forensic discipline, no illusion of only bad people. When you lay them all out together, the vulnerable recruits, the coercive tactics, the innocent dead, Manson's charisma stops looking like an intriguing trait and starts reading as a warning sign. Dexter's charm, by contrast, is written to keep you close. The voiceover confessions, the awkward jokes at Miami Metro, the careful framing of every kill as a necessary line in a moral ledger. His charisma is a narrative device designed for your comfort. Manson's was a weapon that erased other people's lives. Collapsing those two into the same category does more than flatten nuance. It quietly erases the real suffering that men like Manson leave behind. And that is where we need to be very careful before we make the next comparison. And that is exactly the space where the Dexter versus Manson comparison likes to live. It sounds edgy, almost transgressive, to line them up like rival boxers and ask who is worse, who has the higher body count, who is more evil, as if they are characters in the same shared universe waiting to be power scaled. But the moment you do that, you start to see the first problem. You are treating Charles Manson like a narrative device, like another dark anti-hero whose choices exist primarily to provoke you, instead of a historical figure whose decisions shattered real families, real communities, real timelines that never got to play out. It turns a set of crime scene photos and court transcripts into just another season of television. Dexter Morgan is built for that kind of comparison. He is written to be internally consistent and morally legible. We're going to understand his code, his rituals, his plastic, his careful blood work at Miami Metro Homicide. When he kills, the series pauses, explains, frames, and justifies. The camera tells you exactly how to feel about every moment. Manson's life does not work that way. The record is contradictory, full of unreliable accounts, drug-blurred memories, self-mythologizing interviews, and unresolved questions about who gave which order, who believed what, and when the performance started to overtake the person. There is who have to hear their grief reduced to a talking point in someone's who's worse game. When you lay them all out together, fictional framing, real grief, different historical contexts, the edginess starts to look thin. This is the story of our appetite for provocative comparisons more than it is a serious look at either Dexter or Manson. A more honest question is what each story does to us, how Dexter shapes our fantasies about justice, and how Manson should shape our understanding of charismatic violence. Now, let's settle in, get comfortable, because in the next sections, we are going to sit with the ethics and responsibility of how we talk about men like this at all. To get there, we need to look at what television quietly does to us over time. This is the story of how a series like Dexter can make you feel strangely safe in the presence of a knife, as long as it is in the right pair of hands. Or at least in the hands the camera has trained you to trust. Long-form TV gives you hours inside one person's head. You do not meet Morgan the way you meet a suspect at Miami Metro Homicide, across a table, through evidence and testimony. You ride along in his thoughts. You hear him narrate every choice, every doubt, every little joke he makes at his own expense. When you spend that much time in a single point of view, identification stops being a decision and starts being a reflex. Dexter's narration is the anchor. He tells you he is damaged, that Harry gave him a code, that he wishes he could be normal. The humor is dry, self-deprecating, almost bashful. The vulnerability around Rita, Deborah, Harrison, the way he fumbles with ordinary intimacy, all of it keeps you tethered to him rather than to the people on his tables. You are standing beside the predator, not the prey, because that is where the voiceover lives. And then there are the narrative choices that gently sand down your discomfort. The worst of the violence is often implied rather than lingered on. We cut away at the moment of impact. We come back to plastic and blood and a body already still. The series asks you to focus on aftermath, on cleanup, on ritual, on Dexter's emotional growth as he wonders whether he is becoming more human. The suffering itself is compressed into a few quick sounds and then filed away in a slide box. Even law enforcement is reframed. When Miami Metro closes in, the tension we feel is not, will they stop a serial killer, but will Dexter be exposed? Dokes, Lagerta, Lundy, even federal investigations become obstacles to his safety, not instruments of public safety. The same flashing lights that would mean rescue in another show, read here as a threat to the man we have been taught to sit beside. Over time, you start to see a kind of double vision develop. You know, in the abstract, make the contrast impossible to ignore. On one side, you have Dexter Morgan, a solitary figure, governed by a code, moving through Miami Metro Homicide with ritual, control, and a fantasy-level ability to clean up after himself. On the other, you have Charles Manson, no code, no clean edges, no solitary discipline, just a chaotic swarm of followers, drugs, and ideology doing the killing for him. Dexter's world is built to be watched. Every frame, every moment is calibrated for you to follow the mask, to feel the tension of the double life, to enjoy the puzzle of how long he can keep walking into the lab by day after wrapping a room in plastic by night. The story is scored, lit, edited. Even his code is a narrative device, a way to let you sit inside the mind of a killer without feeling like you're endorsing random slaughter. Manson's story is not built that way. It is not a season. It is not a series. It is not a clever inversion of justice. It is a record of people who died in their homes, of a city terrified, of systems that failed to notice a violent cult operating out of a decaying ranch. when you lay them all out together, the crime scene photos, the trial transcripts, the survivor accounts, you start to see how far it is from a prestige anti-hero arc. There is no code. There is only damage. So the problem is not that you watch Dexter. The problem starts when we let the fantasy bleed over into how we talk about real killers. When we start asking whether Manson was as smart as Dexter, or whether Dexter's code would have fixed someone like him, we quietly move Manson from the category of historical harm into the category of interesting villain. And once he is just another villain, the people he hurt become background. Putting Dexter and Manson on the same moral scoreboard flattens everything. It turns Manson into a character study instead of a warning about what happens when charisma, grievance, and ideology find vulnerable people and give them permission to act. It makes Spawn Ranch feel like a grim set instead of a place where real lives were slowly dismantled. A healthier way to hold both is to treat Dexter as a thought experiment about justice and control, a controlled lab environment where we are going to test ideas about punishment, secrecy, and the cost of wearing a mask, and to treat Manson as a case study in how violence actually spreads through groups, institutions, and media. Because when you lay fiction, history, psychology, and media framing next to each other, saying Dexter versus Manson isn't even close, is not about defending Dexter. It is about defending reality from being compressed into content. So, as we go deeper into the psychology, the near misses, and the media myth that actually is, the code does not tell him to cleanse the world. It tells him to stay in his lane. And crucially, that lane is enforced from the inside. Harry may have written the first draft, but by the time we meet Dexter at Miami Metro Homicide, the code lives in Dexter's head like a second, colder conscience. No one is standing over him with a knife, demanding he follow it. He polices himself. He stalks, he tests, he waits, and when a potential target does not meet the standard, he walks away, even when the dark passenger is screaming for release. The structure matters more to him than the thrill. This is the story of a man who needs order so badly that he builds a moral cage for his own monstrosity. Every ritual, every plastic sheet, every blood slide is part of that containment system. It narrows his violence. It keeps it controlled, targeted, almost bureaucratic. There's a dry, chilling irony in watching someone commit murder in a way that looks more like filing than frenzy. Charles Manson, by contrast, did not have a code. He had a creed. Vague, mystical, endlessly flexible. One day it is about helter-skelter. The next, it is about cosmic oneness. The next, it is about proving loyalty through blood. At Spawn Ranch, the doctrine shifts with his mood, his drug use, his paranoia. The rules are whatever he needs them to be in that moment, and they are always imposed outward, onto other people's bodies. Where Dexter's rules say less, smaller, contained, Manson's pseudo-spiritual ideology says more, wider, go further. Followers are encouraged to improvise, to escalate, to read deeper meaning into his rants, and then act on that meaning without clear limits. That is how you get crime scenes like the Tate LaBianca murders, chaotic, overkill, messages smeared on walls, violence radiating in all directions. So, as we go deeper into the psychology of control versus chaos, settle in, get comfortable, and notice what happens when a rulebook is built to restrain one person versus when a creed exists to unleash many. The next step is to look at what these different systems do to the people orbiting them and why one man almost gets caught again and again, while the other drags everyone around him into the abyss. If control versus chaos is the frame, then the next question is simple. Who is this violence actually for? Because once you start to see who the audience is, the gap between Dexter Morgan and Charles Manson stops being a comparison and starts looking like two different species. Dexter's killings are built as intensely private rituals. We are going to stay with him in those quiet, clinical rooms for a moment. The plastic goes up on every surface, sealing out inward, a way to manage an internal compulsion that has nowhere else to go. Narratively, the only others allowed inside are us, listening to his voiceover as he walks through Miami, as he stands in the blood at a homicide scene, as he wraps another body in plastic. That steady commentary keeps the violence psychologically contained. We are not watching a man try to shock the world. We are watching a man try and fail to domesticate the thing humming under his own skin. Manson, by contrast, almost never commits the violence directly. His killings are orchestrated, delegated, staged. The family becomes his cast, Spawn Ranch his rehearsal space, the Tate LaBianca homes his chosen theaters, the words on the walls, the overkill, the scattered clues toward an imagined race war. These are not private compulsions being soothed. They are symbols placed for maximum visibility, designed to be read by police, by neighbors, by headlines. Manson's endgame requires an audience. He needs newspapers, television, cultural shock. Fear is not a side effect. It is the product. Dexter's survival, meanwhile, depends on the opposite. No headlines, no witnesses, no pattern anyone at Miami Metro can convincingly articulate. Every moment he stays invisible, the story continues. When you lay them all out together, you start to see that one man's violence collapses if nobody is watching, while the other's life collapses the instant anyone truly sees. And that difference in audience sets up the next layer. How each man's approach to visibility shapes the trail he leaves behind, and why one becomes a long-running investigation while the other burns into history in a single catastrophic season. So now we move from who is watching to what they would actually see at the scene itself. Settle in, get comfortable, because we are going to walk from Dexter's plastic-wrapped tables straight into the living rooms and driveways the Manson family turned into slaughterhouses. In Dexter's world, every kill is staged like a laboratory experiment. The room is prepped. The plastic sheeting goes up in clean, geometric lines. The victim is restrained, confronted, documented. Morgan takes a single drop of blood for his slide, and when the knife finally moves, the blood is somehow both everywhere and nowhere at once. It spatters in controlled arcs that our favorite analyst could diagram for Miami Metro homicide, and then it disappears into hefty bags and ocean currents. The fantasy is not just that Dexter does this. The fantasy is that he can. That one man with enough planning and enough bleach is tidy. The same is true at the LaBianca home. Multiple entry points, ransacking, words scrawled in blood on walls and refrigerator, a carving fork left jutting from a corpse. This is what real violence looks like when it is carried out by a group of frightened, adrenalized people trying to please a leader who is not even there. It is messy, redundant, and loud. It leaves witnesses, rumors, and a trail of physical evidence that investigators can follow, even without a Dexter-level grasp of pattern analysis. So, when we set Dexter's lab-perfect rituals next to Manson's crime scenes, the comparison collapses. One world is engineered to reassure you that violence can be contained, cleaned up, managed by a single meticulous man with a code. The other shows you that in reality, violence spills into every corner of a house, into the wider city, into history. And that difference in the physical trail sets up the next question. How do institutions respond when faced with a pristine fantasy versus a crime scene that refuses to stay quiet? In Dexter, that institutional response almost always arrives as a surge of panic that then gently drains away. We're going to sit with those surges for a moment because they tell you a lot about how the series manages your breathing. The blood slides get found. The bodies turn up where they were never supposed to be. A colleague at Miami Metro Homicide looks at Morgan just a second too long. And then, almost like a tide, the danger recedes. Think about the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation when you lay them all out together. Dokes corners Dexter at the cabin with the slides, the literal archive of his secret life. For several episodes, the mask is hanging by a thread. FBI profilers point to a forensically skilled insider with a boat. Lagerta remembers every odd detail. The marina itself becomes a trap. It feels like the line has finally snapped. But the story resolves with Dokes framed, the slides replanted, Lila burning the evidence, and the institution gratefully accepting the neat solution. Or earlier, when one of Dexter's bodies surfaces in the wrong place, and the currents of Miami betray him. A dumped corpse washes ashore. A pattern emerges. Someone in the bullpen frowns at a map that suddenly has too many pins in the same quadrant. The tension spikes. You start to see the walls closing in. And then, a jurisdictional quirk, a convenient suspect, or a clever adjustment to his ritual lets the pressure bleed off before it can accumulate. Even his colleagues' suspicions follow this rhythm. Dokes tails him, checks his rentals, tracks his boat. Rita wonders about the missing hours. Deborah brushes against the truth more than once. Internal Affairs hovers. Reporters made the next confession easier. Each piece of physical evidence stayed on the board. In the next section, let's follow how that accumulating weight finally crushed a very real, very fragile operation that had none of Dexter's scripted mercy. And that pressure did not arrive in a single cinematic breakthrough. It arrived the way real investigations usually do, out of order, half understood, and frustratingly slow. This is the story of how Manson actually got caught, not as a dark genius cornered by a rival mastermind, but as a man whose chaos finally left too many traces. At first, there was only confusion. 2 slaughtered homes, 2 different nights, 2 sets of victims who seemed to live in entirely different worlds. Detectives walked into the Tate house and saw words like pig smeared in blood, a pregnant actress, multiple bodies, a scene so over the top that motive almost felt beside the point. The next night, the La Bianca home was similarly brutal, similarly theatrical, but on the surface, there was no obvious thread, no clear suspect, no helpful profile, pointing to a forensically skilled insider with a boat, the way the Bay Harbor Butcher case eventually points at Dexter. Instead, the early Manson investigation looked like a board full of puzzle pieces from the wrong box. The Tate team and the La Bianca team were not immediately sharing everything. Narcotics officers knew Spawn Ranch as a place for stolen cars and drugs, not apocalyptic ideology. Witnesses were high, frightened, inconsistent. You start to see how far this is from Miami Metro Homicide, where every season gifts us a new themed killer and a tidy case file. What finally starts to pull the lines together is not a magic fiber or a perfect lab result. It is people talking. A follower in custody on unrelated charges, bragging in a cell. A girlfriend repeating what she heard. A frightened young woman deciding, in a moment of clarity, that she does not want to die in prison for someone else's prophecy. Jailhouse confessions reach detectives who are already staring at those bloody words on the walls. Rumors about a cult leader who talks about helter-skelter collide with handwriting, with car theft reports, with the fact that some of these kids were already on law enforcement's radar. When you lay them all out together, none of these details looks impressive. A knife here, a boast there, a panicked relocation from Spawn Ranch to the desert because Manson senses vaguely that the heat is rising. This is not Dexter Morgan meticulously bleaching a kill room and checking his slides. This is a man whose followers leave witnesses alive, leave physical evidence everywhere, and cannot stop talking once they are inside a system designed to reward betrayal. We are going to see that his downfall is not a single heroic to his followers, like revelation. This is not charisma as a pleasant personality trait. It is charisma as atmosphere, as weather. He tells them stories about an apocalyptic race war, about helter-skelter, about how the world is ending, and how they, uniquely, are chosen to ride it out. Love bombing is the opening move. You are beautiful. You are free. Your parents were wrong. Society is a lie. Then the erosion starts. Names get replaced with nicknames. Sleep cycles dissolve. The group eats together, trips together, repeats his phrases back to him until the line between their thoughts and his suggestions thins out. When you lay them all out together, the songs, the acid, the sex, the sermons, you start to see how obedience can start to feel like spiritual evolution. By the time the murders happen, his followers are not really acting as discrete agents. They are extensions of his will, convinced that each command is a step toward some higher plane. Saying yes to Manson is framed as saying yes to destiny, to insight, to survival. His charisma expands outward, invasive, filling the available space in a mind, then hollowing it out and rearranging the furniture. This is the story of a man who needs people close so he can live inside them. Dexter Morgan, meanwhile, walks into Miami Metro Homicide with donuts and a smile, and the effect could not be more different. His charm is functional, not immersive. We are going to watch him rehearse small talk in his head, misread jokes, force a laugh half a second too late. He dates Rita. He banters with Masuka. He plays the good brother for Deb. But the current always runs one way. He projects normality outward. He never invites anyone in. His charisma is really a mask, a thin shell stretched over something deliberately inaccessible. Where Manson encourages dependence, Dexter avoids it. Where Manson dissolves individual identity into the group, Dexter clings to compartmentalization as survival. Now, let's hold those two orientations side by side, because the gap between them will matter when we talk about manipulation and consent in the next section, and about why one man builds a cult while the other spends an entire series trying to make sure no one ever truly believes in him. Where Manson dissolves the individual into the group, Dexter's problem is almost the opposite. Every meaningful connection in his life keeps insisting he is an individual, that he is a brother, a boyfriend, a coworker, a father. And every time someone reaches for that version of Morgan, the killer has to pull back, recalibrate, and decide how much of himself he can afford to let them see. Think about the core network the series gives him. Rita is not a follower. She is a fragile kind of refuge. The result is panic, therapy, breakdown, not cohesion. Even in the workplace, where you might expect a Manson-style inner circle to form, the writers refuse that pattern. Batista, Masuka, Lagerta, Quinn, they complicate Dexter's life by caring about him, by investigating him, by promoting him, by sleeping with his sister. They are sources of cover and conscience and constant risk. When you lay them all out together, you start to see that Miami Metro is not a pool of potential disciples. It is a minefield. On the rare occasions Dexter does involve others, Miguel Prado, Lumen, Hannah, the story bends toward collapse. Miguel tries to weaponize Dexter's methods and immediately breaks the code. Lumen's partnership is time-limited, tied to her trauma, and the second she heals, she leaves. Hannah's complicity pushes Dexter out of Miami altogether. This is the story of a man whose power shrinks, not grows, whenever someone shares his secret. Now hold that beside the Manson family, where the entire social architecture exists to do the opposite. Spawn Ranch is designed as a factory for consent, stripping people down with drugs, isolation, and flattery until they will carry out murders he only has to describe. His relationships are instruments. Their purpose is to turn belief into action, conversation into conspiracy, affection into a knife at a stranger's throat. So when people casually compare Dexter to Manson, they skip the structural difference that actually determines how danger spreads. Dexter's world punishes collaboration in his violence. Manson's world only functions because of it. And as we move into how institutions respond to each kind of threat, settle in, get comfortable, because the contrast between hunting one predator and dismantling an entire network is about to get even sharper. If collaboration is where Manson lives, institutions are where Dexter hides. For over a decade, Dexter Morgan walks into Miami Metro Homicide through the front doors, not the back alleys. He signs his name on evidence logs. He stands inside the yellow tape. He is the one literally drawing the red lines that tell everyone else how the blood moved. On paper, that makes him one of the safest people in the room. As a blood spatter analyst, Dexter has access to everything that should protect the public from someone like him. Crime scene photographs, lab reports, chain of custody forms, the quiet gossip that moves between detectives about what the department is really worried about. This week, he sees every pattern, every mistake, every moment where a killer almost leaves too much of themselves behind. And because his job is badge adjacent, wrapped in the credibility of the lab coat and the case file, the system is trained to harbor butcher. The idea that the threat is sitting at the next lab bench is the last possibility anyone wants to entertain. Now, let's set that against Manson. Charles Manson never had a desk at a police station. He had Spawn Ranch, a decaying movie set, heavy drug use, a nomadic commune of young followers drifting through Los Angeles. His appearance, his music, his apocalyptic talk all marked him as an outsider, long before the Tate LaBianca murders. Once suspicion fell on his group, there was no institutional trust to shield him, no professional mask to reinterpret his deviance as dedication. Dexter's fantasy depends on the most dangerous person being the one cataloging the blood, while Manson's reality shows what happens when visible nonconformity keeps drawing focused attention, even when the investigation is slow and clumsy. And as we are going to see next, once that attention finally locks on, The difference between catching a hidden insider and dismantling an obvious outsider's network is not just a matter of evidence, but of what the system is even built to see. Once that attention lands, where it lands matters. Dexter operates in the quiet corners of Miami, slipping between his apartment, his boat, and the fluorescent calm of Miami Metro homicide. Manson builds his world in a place that almost advertises itself. Spawn Ranch, a decaying movie set turned into an open-air stage for every strange decision he makes. Settle in, get comfortable, and picture it. Dusty roads, broken down western facades, horses, bikers, tourists, stuntmen, drifters, and family members, all crossing the same yard. Cars coming and going at all hours. Music and shouting echoing off the hills. Heavy drug use, communal living, and people who look out of place in late 1960s Los Angeles, wandering around in mismatched clothes. Neighbors, ranch hands, local kids, even the owner himself notice. You start to see how impossible it is, in that environment, for anything to stay truly hidden. This is the story of visibility as a slow, grinding risk. Every extra person at Spawn Ranch is another set of eyes, another potential witness, another future interview in a police file. Group crimes multiply that risk. More mouths to talk, more conflicting stories. When detectives start asking basic questions, more physical evidence scattered across different cars, borrowed clothes, and half-remembered drop sites. When you lay them all out together, the Manson family looks less like a sealed conspiracy and more like a leaking container, dripping information over time. And Manson's ideology does not allow for quiet. His control depends on public acts, stealing cars, breaking into houses, squatting on properties, hassling neighbors, blood guy, the donut guy, the colleague who blends into the institutional beige. No caravan of followers, no ranch, no ideology spilling into the street. As we are going to see when we move from cult visibility back into institutional procedure, that difference shapes not only how they are seen, but how the system decides who is even worth chasing first. And once the system has quietly decided who matters, the cameras take over and do something even stranger. They do alchemy. They turn one man into a permanent cultural nightmare, and another into the person you put on in the background while you fall asleep. With Manson, news coverage, books, and films lock onto a handful of images and never let go. The wild eyes under that messy hair, the carved swastika in the forehead, the courtroom outbursts where he sings, laughs, or stares down the judge as if the whole process is a private joke. Over time, those details stop being documentation and become shorthand. You see that face on a magazine cover or a documentary thumbnail, and you do not think about evidence chains or witness testimony. You think simply evil. But that is not the whole story, because this is the story of how myth-making quietly edits out anything that would dilute the monster. The heavy drug use at Spawn Ranch, the way isolation and dependency made followers easier to control, the broader climate of the late 60s, where fear of youth culture and counterculture was already humming in the background. When you lay them all out together, you start to see how much had to go wrong, socially and structurally, before the Tate LaBianca murders ever happened. Yet most retellings flatten that into one man's stare and one carved symbol. Dexter Morgan gets the opposite treatment. The series does not frame him with harsh flashbulbs and courtroom sketches. It wraps him in warm color grading, Miami sunsets, and the hum of air conditioners at Miami Metro Homicide. We are going to watch him kill, but we do it through witty narration, a carefully curated soundtrack, and domestic subplots about kids' breakfasts, sisterly arguments, and office politics. The violence is literal, but the atmosphere is strangely soft. Every ritual is designed to feel controlled. Plastic sheeting folded just so. Tools laid out in neat lines. A code that tells you, again and again, these people deserve it. And when the scene cuts from a blood-soaked kill room to Dexter holding a baby or bantering with a colleague, the edit functions like a reassurance. The horror is contained. The monster has a mask, and the mask is a good coworker, a boyfriend, eventually a dad. Settle in. Get comfortable. The show keeps telling you, this is targeted. This is safe. Explaining the file he has built on this person's life, but the sensory chaos that normally attends homicide is stripped away. No flailing, no frantic flight through a dark hallway, no one pounding on a neighbor's wall. The scene is already contained before the knife ever appears. And then the knife itself is quick. One cut, a controlled motion, close to the heart, close to the plastic. Blood hits the wrap, not the wallpaper. The series rarely lingers on the aftermath. You see a few drops, a slide, a body that is already being packaged away. The camera is more interested in the ritual than the ruin, more interested in the mask Dexter wears in that room than in what it would smell or sound like in reality. When you lay them all out together across season after season, you start to see how much is missing. There is very little gore compared to what Miami Metro Homicide would actually encounter. There are almost no extended shots of a room left destroyed, no family members stumbling onto the scene, no paramedics slipping in pooled blood. The violence is edited down to something repeatable, something you can fall asleep to. Now, set that beside the real Tate and LaBianca crime scenes. Multiple stab wounds, defensive injuries, victims who ran and were dragged back, walls and furniture soaked, pig scrawled in blood, a fork left jutting from a body, neighbors hearing screams and confusion, police walking into a house that looked like a night that had spun completely out of control. This is the story of what group violence actually does when there is no code, no plastic, no cleanup crew. The contrast is not subtle. Dexter's world says killing can be organized, almost hygienic, if the killer is disciplined enough. Manson's world shows you that once people start stabbing other people in real rooms, on real floors, control evaporates almost immediately. And that is where the ethical danger sits. Because when a series makes homicide look tidy, when it reassures you that every drop is accounted for and every victim deserved it, we are going to start fantasizing about necessary violence as a kind of surgical intervention. We picture the plastic, not the screaming. We imagine the code, not the chaos. The more comfortable that fantasy becomes, the easier it is to forget what real blood on real walls actually means. Now, let's stay with that unease and look at what it does to how we judge the people who watch and the people who kill. That unease gets sharper when you put Dexter next to someone like Charles Manson and pretend they are playing the same game. They are not. And when you lay them all out together, the code, the cult, the plastic, the blood on the walls, you start to see that the distance between them is the entire. They were helping to end the world and build a new one. Dexter Morgan, by contrast, never pretends his dark passenger is about history. There is no sermon in the kill room, no promised rebirth. In the series, his murders are framed as maintenance, not transformation, a grim routine he performs to keep something inside him from spilling out onto innocent people. When he talks about the code Harry gave him, it is not a manifesto for society. It is a set of rules for personal containment, a way to narrow the blast radius of something he believes cannot be removed. This is the story of a man who walks into Miami Metro Homicide every morning trying to look small, invisible, ordinary, because the point is not to change the world. The point is to avoid touching it more than he has to. When he does imagine a different life, a family with Rita, a future with Harrison, a quiet cabin far from Florida, the fantasy is always about less impact, fewer bodies, a life where the passenger sleeps. Now let's be clear about what gets lost when we casually equate him with someone like Manson. Ideological violence is designed for maximum footprint. It recruits, it spreads, it seeks headlines, trials, manifestos, followers who keep killing long after the leader is gone. Compulsive, inward-focused violence, at least in the show's logic, strains to stay hidden, to limit witnesses, to keep the circle closed. When we blur that line, we're going to blur how we think about responsibility, prevention, and justice. And that blur is going to matter a lot more once we start asking what a society should actually do with a Manson and what it should do with a Dexter. So let's sit with that blur for a moment, because this is where the comparison between Dexter and Manson gets ethically slippery in a way that can be easy to smooth over if you only look at outcomes. Both end with bodies, but the paths that lead there could not be more different. Manson does not just wake up one night, drive to Cielo Drive, and act alone. He spends years at Spawn Ranch, rehearsing control. He isolates people from their families, keeps them high, keeps them dependent, and then slowly takes a pickaxe to their sense of self. Every rule is his rule. Every song is his song. Over time, you start to see how agency can be hollowed out without ever technically disappearing. His followers still walk, still talk, still hold the knife. But the psychological space in which they are choosing has been narrowed to a corridor he designed. When you lay them all out together, the details are ugly in a very specific way. Sleep deprivation, group rituals, love bombing and humiliation in the same afternoon. A constant drumbeat of apocalyptic fantasy that recasts murder as he builds the code with Harry. He refines it. He hides it. He decides when to follow it and when to break it. There is no cold compound, no Spawn Ranch, no chorus of voices chanting his rules back to him. And every single season, when he stands over a table in plastic, the writers are careful. The only person being pulled into that ritual space is you, the viewer. We are going to watch him rationalize, compartmentalize, and proceed. There is no plausible deniability about manipulation. If anything, the tension in Dexter is that he is almost too responsible, too self-aware, in a way real offenders almost never are. When you flatten Dexter and Manson into the same category of killer, you sand down all of this. You lose the language to talk about how cults work, how consent is eroded, how someone can be both victim and perpetrator at the same time. And you also risk turning Dexter's very deliberate, very solitary choices into something softer than they are, as if invoking a dark passenger makes him less accountable. That flattening matters, because once you stop seeing the difference between a follower acting under long-term coercion and a lone killer operating under a personal code, you stop asking the right questions about prevention? Do you dismantle a network, or do you confront an individual? Do you build systems to detect manipulation, or systems to catch the one person who never needs anyone else in the room? The answers start to diverge sharply. Settle in. Get comfortable with that discomfort, because in the next section, we are going to follow those diverging paths all the way into policy and punishment, and ask what a justice system built for real people should actually do with stories this different. And that brings us to something the show almost never says out loud, but keeps proving over and over again. Dexter Morgan looks like he is in control, not just of his urges or his victims, but of the entire chain of cause and effect that follows every kill. This is the story of a man who believes that if he thinks far enough ahead, nothing truly unexpected can touch him. Watch how the series does it. A crime scene gets called in while he has a body in the trunk, and somehow the route to Miami Metro still lets him dump the remains on the way. A blood slide goes missing, and it turns out to be in the hands of someone he can frame or eliminate. A suspect wakes up on the table, cuts through the plastic, and for a breath, you think the mask has slipped for good. Then Dexter improvises, recalibrates, and the narrative folds itself back around his plan. Even when the plan breaks, the frame does not. The Bay Harbor Butcher investigation closes in. The profile points straight at a forensics insider, with fork stabbings and rambling slogans that confuse investigators, but also ensure the case never goes away. There is no clean room, no wipe-down surface, no careful disposal. There are witnesses, rumors, loose talk in jail cells, and within months, the web of conspiracy starts tightening around the very mastermind who thought he could stay off stage. When you lay them all out together, you start to see the mastermind fantasy collapse under real conditions. Dexter's world bends toward his control. Manson's world shreds his. Real violence produces chaos, fear, human error, and a trail of evidence that does not care how charismatic you are. Settle in. Get comfortable with that gap. Because next, we are going to follow how our courts and our culture respond to these two stories of control, and what it costs us when we keep believing that anyone ever truly has it. That gap between Dexter's control and Manson's chaos should be enough to keep them in separate mental folders, but it doesn't stay that way for long. We keep dragging them back into the same box, the same word, the same easy label, monster. This is the story of how our brains try to tidy up. Fear. We like clean categories, the way Dexter Morgan likes a clean kill room. Serial killer, cult leader, psychopath. If we can name it, we think we can recognize it. And if we can recognize it, we tell ourselves we can avoid it. The labels feel like plastic wrap we can pull tight over something that is otherwise leaking into every corner of ordinary life. When you lay them all out together, those labels start to blur. Put Dexter and Manson side by side in a headline or a thumbnail, and you start to see how tempting it is to pretend that extreme violence is one thing, one profile, one cause, one solution. A damaged childhood here, a lack of empathy there, a few ominous traits you could spot in a neighbor, or in a coworker at Miami Metro homicide if you were just paying enough attention. But that is its own kind of fantasy, because the truth is, real violence does not organize itself around our categories. Some people kill for ideology, some for money, some out of panic, some in patterns that look nothing like Dexter's code or Manson's apocalyptic storytelling. When we squeeze Dexter and Manson into the same outline, we flatten all of that variation into a single, soothing picture. The monster, as a type you can learn once and then file away forever. That flattening is emotionally comforting. It suggests there is a checklist somewhere. If you can spot the charismatic drifter or the quiet blood analyst who keeps to himself, you can intervene before the horror starts. It reassures you that the danger lives at the edges of society, in cult compounds, and shadowy. Settle in, get comfortable, because to understand why the Dexter-Manson comparison collapses, we have to look at how each man's story was written long before we ever met them. One of them was outlined on whiteboards in a writer's room. The other was splashed across front pages in jagged, half-true headlines. Dexter Morgan exists inside a sealed laboratory of narrative control. Every season, a team of writers sits down and decides where the mask will slip, when a close call will land, how Miami Metro homicide will almost connect the dots and then miss by an inch. Pacing is not an accident. A near discovery in episode 3 can echo a decision from episode 1 because someone literally wrote a line on a board and drew an arrow between them. This is the story of a killer engineered for prestige television. His code, his rituals, even the way blood fans across a wall are framed through lenses designed for maximum engagement and eventual catharsis. When Dexter almost gets caught, the scene has already been tested in the minds of a dozen people, asking how much tension you can take before you need a release, a joke, a confession, a body disappearing into the ocean. Now, let's hold that up against Charles Manson's entrance into public consciousness. There was no writer's room at Spawn Ranch. There were drugs, paranoia, conflicting testimonies, and a set of crime scenes so chaotic that even the investigators struggled to build a coherent story. What most of us met first was not the man, but the tabloid version. Wild eyes, carved forehead, the word cult, doing all the work that context and nuance were supposed to do. Tabloid coverage thrives on rupture, not structure. Instead of carefully planted clues, you get fragmented updates, anonymous sources, and dramatic courtroom sketches. One day, Manson is a mastermind. The next, he is a pathetic drifter, and the tension between those frames is never resolved, because resolution is not the goal. Shock is. Circulation is. The headline is the hero. Narrative control shifts accordingly. Dexter's story is curated by showrunners and directors who can decide exactly how sympathetic or monstrous he feels from moment to moment. Manson's story has been curated by prosecutors seeking convictions, journalists chasing angles, and later a true crime industry that knows a marketable monster when it sees one. Each group trims, exaggerates, and rearranges until the messy human being is almost impossible to find underneath. When you lay them all out together, you start to see that we are not comparing two men at all. We are comparing two narrative ecosystems. One is a prestige series where every beat is tuned for you to follow, understand, and uncomfortably empathize. Every episode releases you. A clever improvisation, a forged report, a body disposed of just in time. That rhythm trains you. You start to see Dexter as the fixed point in the chaos, the one who will always find the angle. Even his near captures are curated to highlight competence. Dokes tails him. The FBI profile lands squarely on a forensically skilled insider with a boat. Lagerta quietly connects the Bay Harbor butcher to someone inside homicide. Yet the series bends each of those moments so that, at the last second, Dexter outthinks, outmaneuvers,
or is saved by an accident of timing. The narrative promise underneath is simple. He is in control, even when he is not.
Now set that beside the way Charles Manson entered public consciousness. There is no carefully paced season arc, no intimate access to his internal monologue. There are headlines about helter-skelter, satanic cults, and apocalyptic race wars. There are mugshots with the wild stare, the swastika carved into his forehead, the grainy footage of followers chanting outside the courthouse. Instead of rising tension and resolution, you get disconnected spikes of lurid detail, bizarre quotes, and images that collapse a tangle of drugs, social breakdown, and psychological damage into a single, cartoonish villain. Repetition works differently in each medium. With Dexter, every close call, every near miss, every time the mask almost comes off, is another lesson in his precision. The more he nearly gets caught, the more the series reassures you that he can dance on that edge. With Manson, the repeated images are not about competence, but spectacle. The same mugshot, the same carved symbol, the same few lines of courtroom ranting. When you lay them all out together, what you remember is not the banality of his manipulations or the sloppy, chaotic reality of the murders, but a kind of theatrical madness. And that is the crucial distortion. Our emotional reactions are responding to narrative framing, not to any careful moral calculus about body counts, agency, or harm. We're going to see that this matters far beyond television, because the same habits of attention that make Dexter feel controlled and Manson feel like a comic book monster do not stop at your screen. They bleed into juries, into policy debates, into who receives sympathy and who is written off as irredeemable. In the next section, we will follow that bleed in the real world and watch what it does there. So settle in, get comfortable, because if that bleed from screen to real life is powerful, it starts with something very simple. We are going to like Dexter Morgan, not reluctantly, not in spite of ourselves, by design. From the first episode, this contrast is not accidental. It is the operating system of the series. This is the story of a murderer, but it is told in the grammar of a family drama, because we are inside his decision-making process. We hear the doubts before the duct tape. We listen to him argue with the code of Harry, to his fear that he might slip, to the rationalizations that a child killer or a wife beater somehow deserves what is coming. The show lets you watch him hesitate over a photo, recheck a file, stand on the edge of a kill room, and almost turn back. Judgment softens when you're allowed to witness the hesitation, the self-questioning, the tiny flickers of guilt that look so much like conscience. Now, set that beside Charles Manson, as most of us encounter him. There is no warm narration walking you through his childhood. There is no quiet scene of him packing a lunch or helping with homework. There are mugshots. There are courtroom outbursts. There are secondhand accounts from former followers and prosecutors and journalists, each one adding another layer of distance. We never inhabit his interior life. We observe his performance. And that asymmetry matters. If the camera followed Manson the way it follows Dexter, if you heard him explain every manipulation, every petty grievance, every drug-fueled sermon at Spawn Ranch, you would not excuse him, but you would at least feel the pull of proximity. Instead, his story is told almost entirely from the outside as a spectacle to be condemned, not a mind to be inhabited. So, when people casually compare Dexter to Manson, the scale is already tipped. One is engineered sympathy, the other is engineered revulsion. In a later section, we are going to sit with what it means that our instincts about punishment, justice, even vigilantism can be steered this easily by who the camera decides to stand beside. And that steering does not stop with how we feel about the killers themselves. It also shapes how we feel about risk, about danger, about what it means to almost get caught. For 8 seasons and a revival, Dexter Morgan lives inside a carefully curated tension. Every close call, every near miss, every time the mask almost slips at Miami Metro Homicide is choreographed like a dance. A missing blood slide from his wooden box. A colleague like Dokes or Lagerta watching just a little too closely. A security camera, a marina record, an inconvenient traffic cam that appears at the worst possible moment. And then, at the last possible second, the alibi that holds. The story that fits. The evidence that points somewhere else. You start to see that these sequences are not just suspense for suspense's sake. They are reassurance. This is the story of a mix of screaming, improvisation, and overkill. Messages smeared in blood on the walls. A crime scene so chaotic that investigators first have to work out what happened before they can even begin to ask who did it. There is no clean line of intent, no elegant pattern for a profiler to decode, just violence spilling in every direction. When you lay them all out together, the contrast becomes unavoidable. Dexter's world offers you the illusion that violence can be perfectly contained, bounded by a code, insulated from the innocent by one man's discipline. Manson's world shows how quickly that fantasy collapses the moment real people, real drugs, real fear, and real incompetence enter the room. And this is where we are going to slow down even further, because the next step is to put specific moments side by side. The missing slide versus the bloody towel. The suspicious colleague versus the talkative follower. The almost capture that resets the series versus the investigative break that ends the story. So let's do that. Let's put Dexter's supposed perfection under a microscope and watch where the fibers start to fray. One of the earliest cracks comes in the ice truck killer case. When Dexter misreads the timeline and assumes he understands the other killer's ritual, he thinks he's the only one choreographing crime scenes for effect. He underestimates how precisely Brian is mirroring him, how deliberately those clues are being staged. The result is a series of near collisions at Miami Metro Homicide, where his private investigation and the official one almost intersect in the paperwork. Nothing explodes, but you start to see how fragile the illusion of control really is. Then there are the physical traces, the little betrayals of matter and time. Dexter prides himself on plastic, bleach, and tide charts, yet we watch him leave behind a bloody shoe print Rita can find, or a towel with suspicious stains that should never have left his car. He misjudges how long a body will stay hidden, or how quickly a current will carry bags of dismembered remains. When you lay them all out together, the pattern is not of a flawless technician, but of someone who is constantly being saved by narrative timing and institutional distraction. Each mistake is calibrated. The missing blood slide that Dokes discovers, the algae linking the Bay Harbor butcher to a specific marina, the surveillance footage that almost shows Dexter at the wrong place. They are all close enough to feel catastrophic in the moment, but always just far enough that a lie, a fire, or another suspect can absorb the impact. This is the story of a world everyone down. Settle in, get comfortable, because next we're going to follow that contrast from the lab to the living room, from Dexter's controlled kill rooms to the way both stories handle families, followers, and the cost of being seen. Dexter's world is built on tight lines and clean exits. Manson's fell apart on the road, in holding cells, and in the mouths of people who could not stop talking. Now, we're going to slow that unraveling down and follow the chain that actually led back to him. Not a single brilliant profiler at the center. No Miami Metro homicide montage where the red string suddenly forms a perfect pattern. Just bad decisions, loose lips, and a web that breaks under its own weight. It starts with something almost boring: stolen cars. After the Tate killings, members of the family are stopped driving vehicles taken from victims or from other crimes orbiting the ranch. License plates do not match registrations, stories do not line up, and routine traffic work begins putting names like Tex Watson into systems. Dexter Morgan spends whole seasons making sure no car, no boat, no rental ever points back to his kill rooms. Manson's people cannot even keep their transportation quiet. Then there is jail, not as a final destination, but as an echo chamber. While Dexter's mask depends on silence and controlled confession to exactly one person at a time, Manson's followers land in custody on unrelated charges and start bragging. They talk about creepy crawls, about stabbing, about helter-skelter. One inmate tells another, who tells a deputy, who tells a detective. This is the story of how gossip becomes evidence. Witness testimony, not forensic genius, does most of the heavy lifting. A young woman named Susan Atkins boasts in a cell about killing for Charlie. A cellmate turns informant. Ranch hands and neighbors recall strange nights, gunshots, stolen property. A family member remembers Manson ordering a change of clothes or burning something in a barrel. When you lay them all out together, you start to see how ordinary observation and self-preservation create a trail straighter than any blood spatter pattern. Physical items quietly lock that trail in place. A discarded gun traced back to a previous incident. A rope matching the type used in the house. A fingerprint here, a bloody print there. Fibers and clothing and knives that were never properly hidden. Dexter spends an entire series obsessing over a single drop of blood on a plate, one missing slide, one misfiled report. Manson's circle leaves entire crime scenes screaming their presence, then wanders off, assuming fear and confusion will do the rest. And under all of it is Manson himself, unable to stay small. Long after the credits roll, the fantasy of the mastermind, the idea that somewhere, above all the noise and chaos, there is one mind that sees every angle, anticipates every move, and never really loses. Dexter Morgan is written to sit almost perfectly inside that fantasy. In Miami Metro Homicide, by day, he is the quiet analyst who notices the microscopic cast-off that everyone else missed. At night, he is the hunter who already scouted the victim's patterns, checked the security cameras, wiped the parking garage for prints. Every ritual kill, every improvised escape, every moment where the mask almost slips is framed as proof that he is several moves ahead, playing a private game of chess while everyone else is still learning the rules. When a blood slide goes missing, Dexter already has a contingency. When Dokes tails him, Dexter has backup plans for his backup plans. Even when things go wrong, the series bends back toward the image of Morgan as near omniscient planner, someone who can turn any slip into a setup, any coincidence into part of a larger design. It is the fantasy of total control over chaos, and we're going to see how seductive that becomes when you watch it season after season. Charles Manson, in the popular imagination, gets pulled into that same template. He is often described as an all-powerful puppet master at Spahn Ranch, orchestrating the Tate LaBianca murders like a general directing troops. The narrative turns his rambling ideology, heavy drug use, and inconsistent commands into something that looks like a coherent plan. But when you look at the actual nights of the killings, what you find is improvisation, confusion, followers asking for clarification, and Manson himself not even present at the Tate house when the violence exploded. His control over the so-called family was real, but it was wavering, chemically altered, and constantly patched over with fear and charisma rather than precise strategy. He sent people out with vague instructions to start a race war, then reacted to their messy, bloody results. That is not the same thing as Dexter's clean kill room or his meticulous code. It is closer to a rolling accident that no one inside the group could fully steer. So why do we keep reaching for the mastermind frame anyway? Because one mind is easier to hold than dozens of small, ugly factors. A single architect makes a story feel clean, morally legible, and strangely comforting. If one person is responsible, then, in theory, one person could have been stopped. When you lay them all out together, you start to see how this myth does double work. It props up Dexter's appeal by treating his survival as proof of genius, and it exaggerates Manson's coherence by retrofitting chaos is carrying the weight. That solitude matters. It means that when Dexter makes a mistake, there is no one else to blame. When a drop of blood is out of place, when a boat trip from Miami to a dumping ground almost overlaps with a Coast Guard patrol, the responsibility is painfully simple. It is his. The violence is narratively contained inside one psyche, one set of compulsions, one man trying to keep his mask straight every single moment he walks into Miami Metro homicide. Manson is the opposite shape. On paper, he is the center. In practice, the harm radiates outward through people who are high, unstable, eager to impress, and constantly misreading what he wants. He talks about a race war, about helter-skelter, about pigs and revolution. The orders are vague, half-coded, sometimes sung, sometimes mumbled. The Tate LaBianca murders are not the work of a lone technician. They are group projects carried out by followers who stab too many times, leave too much evidence, improvise cruelty that even Manson did not script line by line. And once you introduce followers, you introduce chaos. Group dynamics mean competing loyalties, jealousies, and the strange bravado of not wanting to be the one who hesitates. Heavy drug use at Spahn Ranch blurs memory and judgment. One person thinks the message on the wall should be bloodier. Another thinks the victims should suffer longer. A third mishears a comment and believes they have permission to escalate. The violence stops being a single, grim procedure and becomes a feedback loop, each person amplifying the others. When you lay them all out together, you start to see why the comparison collapses. Dexter's kills, for all their horror, move along one narrow track in the story. Manson's crimes spread through a network, across nights, houses, accomplices, and later copycats who romanticize the family without understanding how disorganized and squalid it really was. This is the story of scale as much as intent. one man versus many followers. One contained pathology versus a social infection. And as we move forward, we are going to see how that difference in diffusion changes everything about legal responsibility, media myth, and the way the public decides who is monstrous and who is merely following orders. And once you start thinking in terms of infection, instead of just individual impulse, the law suddenly looks a lot less simple than a single killer and a single victim. Settle in, get comfortable, because we are going to sit with that complexity for a moment and watch how it pulls Manson and Dexter into completely different moral universes. In the real world, the legal system has a tool for dealing with people who harm through others. They leaned into the chaos, the heavy drug use, the group chanting, the shifting stories, the bloody, disorganized crime scenes that left physical evidence everywhere. The argument was not that he outsmarted the system, but that he warped a group so thoroughly that they carried his violence into the world for him. Conspiracy law is built for exactly that kind of diffuse, ugly influence. Now, let's hold that next to Dexter Morgan. In his world, responsibility is almost aggressively clean. One killer, one victim, one decision maker. He stalks alone, wraps the room in plastic alone, delivers the blow alone. Even when he involves someone else, the series usually bends back toward a single consciousness at the center, a solitary mind making a solitary choice under the glow of a Miami streetlight. That framing does something quiet but powerful. It makes the moral math feel solvable. You can sit with a scene, weigh this victim against that code, and decide whether Dexter's latest table was justified. Because the show has stripped away the mess of followers, bystanders, and institutions that enable him. The law that caught Manson is built to recognize that mess as part of the harm. Dexter's fictional framework erases it, and in doing so, it makes a certain kind of violence feel containable, even almost responsible. And as we move forward, this gap between how the law sees someone like Manson and how the series asks you to see Dexter is going to become the hinge for something else, the way media, myth, and audience sympathy start quietly rewriting who we think the real monsters are. That hinge swings open the widest when you stop looking at evidence and start looking at purpose, not just what they did, but what the violence is trying to accomplish. With Dexter, the story of every kill begins in the same place, inside. Morgan talks about his dark passenger the way someone else might talk about chronic pain. It is constant, intrusive, and fundamentally private. The code Harry gives him is not a political program or a social crusade. It is a containment strategy, a set of rules designed to point that pressure inward, to keep it from spilling randomly into Miami, Metro, homicide, or his carefully arranged life. So, when Dexter wraps a room in plastic and confronts a murderer, he narrates it as justice, as cleaning up what the courts missed. But that is not the engine. The engine is compulsion. The fantasy of social benefit arrives later, as a story he tells himself so that the ritual feels orderly instead of pathological. His kills stay tethered to his own biography, his own trauma, his own need to manage the thing humming under his mask. Manson is the opposite. With him, the urge is outward from the start, categorical break. Dexter's violence is inward-facing and bounded. It is about regulating an internal storm so his day life can continue. Manson's is outward-facing and expansive. It is about tearing the world open so his imagined future can crawl out. One is a fictional model of containment. The other is a historical case study in how belief turns into campaigns of terror. And yet, as we are going to see, the series keeps nudging Dexter's private compulsion towards something that looks like rough social reform, blurring that line just enough that you can almost forget how far apart these two kinds of danger really are. The danger is that it feels good. Dexter's code is presented like a pressure valve for a broken system, and we are going to notice how quickly that framing starts to soothe you. He only kills people who deserve it. He focuses on those who slipped through the cracks of courts and juries and plea deals. Every time he lays out the plastic and the knives, the series whispers that balance is about to be restored. The mechanics of that are very careful. Dexter does not stalk petty thieves or negligent drivers. He hunts child killers, serial rapists, cartel enforcers. Miami Metro Homicide fails to hold them. Morgan finishes the job. The show gives you files, flashbacks, and confessions on the table. We see trophies. We hear victims, names. We watch the mask of normalcy drop from Dexter's targets in that final moment before the blade. Moral gray areas are minimized on purpose so that your relief can be maximized. And every season doubles down on this curation. Trinity is not just a killer. He is a ritualistic monster who destroys families. The Bay Harbor butchers' early victims are butchers themselves. Even when Dexter slips, like with an innocent man on his table, the narrative snaps back to the code as if the problem was a rare procedural error, not the premise itself. This is the story of a murderer whose brand management is immaculate. Now, let's hold that beside Manson. His targets were not people who had gotten away with it. They were strangers chosen for symbolic value, for what they represented in his paranoid reading of the world. Sharon Tate and the others at Cielo Drive were living their lives, not dodging justice. The La Bianca murders were framed with bizarre messages on the walls, not evidence of crimes uncovered, but slogans for an imagined race war. When you lay them all out together, you start to see the split. Dexter's victims are narratively overqualified for punishment. Manson's victims were simply available to his ideology. One system is built to reassure you that the knife is going in the right direction. The other shows you what happens when a charismatic man can be ordinary. At Miami Metro Homicide, he is the guy with the donuts, the slightly awkward blood guy who smiles, a beat too late, but never raises his voice. He is non-threatening by design. When you watch him at the briefing table or joking gently with Masuka, you start to see that his charm is really just negative space. He is careful not to be memorable, careful not to be intense, careful to give every person exactly what keeps them from looking any deeper. This is the story of a man whose charisma functions like a lab coat. It is professional, neutral, and disposable. Dexter's nice is camouflage, not a net. He does not gather followers. He diffuses suspicion. When Rita leans on him as the safe, stable presence after Paul's chaos, Dexter does not reshape her worldview. He simply inhabits the outline of the good boyfriend she already needs. Even when he mentors someone, like Miguel Prado, his instinct is to limit, to compartmentalize, to keep his code sealed off, rather than turn it into a shared doctrine. Manson's charisma moves in the opposite direction. Where Dexter pulls back, Manson pushes in. At Spawn Ranch, the songs, the late-night monologues, the acid-fueled rituals were not background color. They were constant psychological pressure. He talked and talked until ordinary language broke down. until his followers' sense of self thinned out and his voice became the one that filled the silence. Every speech about helter-skelter, every rambling prophecy was an attempt to overwrite someone's internal narration with his own. And unlike Dexter's quiet mask, that presence was active and aggressive. Manson needed people to act for him. His entire project depended on pulling vulnerable drifters into his moral universe and keeping them there with repetition, isolation, and fear. The murders he orchestrated were not clean, precise executions. They were chaotic, crowded scenes where multiple followers carried out his instructions, chanting his phrases, leaving his ideology literally written on the walls. When you lay them all out together, you start to see the structural difference. Dexter's charisma is defensive. It is the soft power of not alarming the room, of letting colleagues project whatever harmless story they want onto him so he can keep working alone. Manson's charisma is offensive. It is a weapon aimed outward, designed to bend other people's will until they commit violence in his name. One man's danger increases when he is left alone. The other's danger multiplies every time he is believed. Now, settle in, get comfortable, because next we're going to follow that line outward and watch what happens to the people who orbit each of them, and how the long-term damage of a quiet mask is similar in shape. Every odd late night, every half-truth, every unexplained injury adds a layer of confusion she cannot quite name. When she dies at the hands of Trinity, the show frames it as the cost of Dexter's double life catching up with him, a brutal punctuation mark that pushes his story forward. Colleagues at Miami Metro feel smaller versions of this. LaGuerta's lingering suspicion, Batista's sense that something never quite added up, Masuka's offhand jokes that land a little too close to the truth. The pattern is consistent: suspicion, confusion, betrayal, and then some form of meaning is carved out of it by the finale. Now, set that beside the people who lived through Manson. There is no writer's room to shape their grief into a clean 3-act structure. Survivors of the Tate LaBianca murders, the families of the dead, and the former family members who carried out the killings live with a kind of ongoing sentence. PTSD that flares with every documentary, stigma that follows them into jobs and relationships, guilt that does not resolve because there is no final episode where everyone understands why it had to happen. This is the story of 2 timelines. Television can compress and tidy emotional arcs. It can give Deborah a collapse, a moral crisis, and an endpoint that, however bleak, feels like an answer. Real life does not. For Manson's orbit, time does not heal so much as accumulate. Every parole hearing is a fresh wound. Every retelling reanimates the night. When you lay them all out together, you start to see the structural difference. Dexter's world is built to fold back into itself by the season finale, to offer you catharsis, however dark. Manson's world radiates outward for decades, touching people who were not even born in 1969. And as we move forward, we're going to watch how time itself treats these 2 stories. One you can binge in a weekend, and one that the legal system and the culture keep replaying, whether anyone wants to or not. Time for Manson does not fade to black. It files paperwork. It schedules hearings. It drags everyone back into the same room, under the same fluorescent lights, to repeat the same arguments about danger, remorse, and whether a man who orchestrated the Tate LaBianca murders should ever walk free. For decades, Manson's name has kept reappearing on parole calendars. Every few years, the state convenes a panel. Survivors and victims' families write statements. Lawyers argue about his age, his influence, his supposed evolution. And every single time, the underlying question is the same but heavier. What does justice look like when the person who set the violence in motion is still breathing? This is the story of a crime, and forgiveness is refreshed. But the people who actually lost someone are asked, again, to be exhibits in that argument. There is no clean endpoint here, only an ongoing negotiation between memory, law, and an audience that never quite looks away. Dexter Morgan's world, by design, works differently. The series gives you arcs you can chart: the Ice Truck Killer season, the Bay Harbor Butcher season, Trinity, and eventually New Blood. Every season winds the tension tighter, and then, on schedule, releases it. A killer is confronted, a secret is contained, a relationship is broken or mended. Even when the finale choices are controversial, they are still choices made to close a chapter. The credits roll. You can stop. When you lay them all out together, you start to see the structural divide. Dexter's story is built to end on cue. Manson's keeps echoing through parole boards, legal records, and late-night reruns. One narrative invites you to settle in, get comfortable, and finish it over a weekend. The other insists on returning, uninvited, forcing us to ask why we keep replaying both of them and what that repetition reveals about how we live with violence at all. So we end up with this strange double habit. We fall asleep to Dexter Morgan's carefully scored kills, and we keep reopening documentaries and trial footage about Charles Manson. On the surface, it can feel like the same ritual, the same late-night fascination with people who cross the line the rest of us never will. But when you lay them all out together, the differences stop being cosmetic and start becoming the whole point. Dexter is driven by an internal compulsion, a private hunger that he tries to cage with Harry's code and forensic discipline. His story is one man wrestling his own circuitry, trying to aim something he cannot turn off. Manson, by contrast, is not managing a compulsion so much as staging an ideological crusade, however incoherent. He builds a worldview out of racism, apocalypse, and pop mysticism, and then pushes other people to act it out for him. Dexter operates alone, even when he looks surrounded. Miami Metro Homicide is his workplace, his cover, his hunting ground, but the kill room is always a closed set. Plastic, tools, one victim, one killer. Manson is the opposite, a cult leader who never stops performing. Spawn Ranch is crowded, drugged, unstable. Every crime is a group project, full of witnesses, rivalries, and people who will eventually talk. Where Dexter tightens control until there is almost no air left in the room, Manson thrives on chaos he pretends to command. And then there is the frame around them. Dexter is curated fiction. Every season is structured, edited, resolved. Manson forces us to sit with the fact that real harm is not tidy, not narratively fair, and not guaranteed to end when the credits roll. And when you start to see that gap clearly, you start to see why the comparison is not just uneven, it is misleading. Understanding that distance matters, because next we are going to look more directly at what it means to turn violence into a bedtime story, and what responsibility creators and audiences carry when we do. So now that we have that gap in view, we are going to do something very simple and very steady. We're going to line these two figures up side by side, and just look. No hype, no myth, just the shapes they actually take when you lay them all out together. Dexter Morgan is, first and last, a construct. He exists because a writer's room in a building somewhere decided that Miami needed a blood spatter analyst who was also a vigilante killer, bound by a code that only targets people who deserve it. Every moment of his story is filtered through that code, through network standards, through what you can show at 9 p.m. and still sell advertisements. The plastic, the knives, the perfectly wrapped rooms, even the way he talks about his dark passenger are narrative tools, tuned to keep you close enough to feel the danger and far enough to keep watching. Manson, by contrast, is not tuned to anything. He is a historical criminal who never had to pass a standards and practices meeting. This is the story of a man who built a cult out of isolation, drugs, and recycled ideology at Spahn Ranch, then sent other people out to do the killing for him. The Tate LaBianca scenes were not clean tables and controlled lighting. They were chaotic, bloody, loud, full of panic and mistakes. The only writers were detectives trying to reconstruct what had already happened, and prosecutors trying to explain how someone who barely touched a knife could still orchestrate so much death. Psychologically, the contrast only sharpens. Dexter compartmentalizes. He clocks in at Miami Metro Homicide, smiles, brings donuts, and files, reports with forensic discipline. Then he crosses an invisible line and becomes the hunter, cataloging trophies, cleaning up trace evidence, tracking his own patterns with almost bureaucratic precision. Manson relies on something messier, charisma that shifts from charming to menacing, responsibility that is always diffuse, orders that are half suggestion and half command, often buried under LSD and apocalyptic rambling. Dexter narrows control down to a single point. Manson dissolves control into the group and then hides inside it. Structurally, the stories barely touch. Dexter's world is built on scripted near misses and could feel that way. The code, the plastic, the ritual, they are all there to reassure you that every moment of horror has a frame around it. He stalks, he confirms guilt, he wraps the room in plastic, he delivers a rehearsed speech. Then the knife, the slide, the sea. It is violence as procedure, almost as hygiene, where every drop of blood has a purpose and every body disappears on schedule. But that is not how real violence behaves. When you lay them all out together, the Tate House, the LaBianca home, the Spahn Ranch stories, you start to see just how fragile the idea of control really is. The Manson murders were soaked in drugs, ideology, fear, and improvisation. Orders were vague, motives shifted, followers misheard or overperformed. Rooms were not wrapped, they were ransacked. Walls were not wiped, they were written on. Control existed only in Manson's head, and even there it flickered. On Dexter, Morgan's ritual is a closed loop. The victim is alone. The table is prepared. The timeline is clean. In 1969, Los Angeles, every line of the story frayed the moment the first door opened. Neighbors heard screams. A surviving victim at Spahn Ranch talked. Stolen property moved through the city. Rumors about the family accumulated inside police reports that did not yet know they belonged to the same case. The chaos that would ruin a Dexter kill is exactly what made the Manson investigation possible. Real detectives, unlike Miami Metro Homicide on the series, live in that chaos. They compare inconsistent witness statements. They follow up on bad tips that accidentally reveal something useful. They notice when the same names keep surfacing in different files. The Manson case turned not on one brilliant forensic epiphany, but on a slow, messy braid of physical evidence, confessions, jailhouse bragging, and bureaucratic persistence. The investigation thrived on everything Dexter's world edits out: noise, error, and human unpredictability. So, when the show gives you near-perfect cleanups and close calls that resolve at the last second, those are not templates. They are engineered illusions of control. This is the story of a universe that quietly bends to protect its protagonist, where tides always cooperate, security cameras miss just enough, and colleagues at Miami Metro Homicide consistently look away one scene before it really matters. Now, let's sit with what that illusion invites you to believe, because the next step is not about blood spatter or boat slips. It is about the fantasy that if you were disciplined enough, righteous enough, you could do what Dexter does without ever becoming what Manson was. And that is where the danger really starts to show. Because underneath that invisible, omniscient committee, this is the story of violence with paperwork, violence with due diligence, violence that arrives only after Miami Metro Homicide and the entire justice system have supposedly failed. Now place that next to Charles Manson. His victims are not curated monsters. They are a pregnant actress, a coffee heiress, a supermarket executive, friends who happen to be at the wrong house, people whose names you only learn because of how they died. The Tate LaBianca murders are not carefully lit kill rooms. They are chaotic, drug-fueled home invasions, with messages smeared in blood, neighbors hearing screams, and bodies left as symbols rather than solved equations. There is no catharsis there, only randomness, vulnerability, the sense that violence can walk through any unlocked door and choose anyone at all. When you lay them all out together, Dexter's victims and Manson's victims, you start to see how much work the fiction is doing on your behalf. One set has been stripped of ambiguity, so that every stab feels like balance being restored. The other set keeps all its ambiguity, so every wound feels like the world tilting off its axis. The show invites you to root for Dexter's escapes because it wraps his violence in control. We are going to watch him dodge suspicion, outthink Miami Metro, slide past Laguerta's doubts, and the tension comes from whether his careful system will hold. With Manson, there is no such safety net. You are not hoping he gets away from the law. You are hoping the law gets to him in time. And that is the uncomfortable hinge. The fantasy of good violence depends on three things: control, certainty, and a kind of godlike knowledge about who deserves to die. No real person has that. Not a blood spatter analyst, not a cult leader in the desert, not any of us. Once you take away the narrator who guarantees you that the right people are on the table, the whole structure starts to look less like justice and more like whoever happens to be holding power. Settle in, get comfortable with that tension, because the next step is asking what it means that we keep telling and retelling this fantasy on screen, long after we have seen what happens when someone like Manson believes it in real life. And this is where the stories we tell about people like Morgan and the stories we tell about people like Manson start quietly working on us. Dexter is prestige fiction. Every frame of that series, every season arc is engineered. The writers build a careful rhythm of close calls and reprieves, of almost captures that tighten the noose just enough to keep you watching without quite cutting off his air. You sit in Miami Metro Homicide with him. You hear his narration. You feel the weight of the code. The whole icon on a poster, demonized and glamorized, sometimes in the same breath. In both cases, a storytelling machine is at work. Dexter's machine is prestige television, with empathy as its fuel. Manson's machine is sensational true crime, with shock and spectacle as its currency. And if we are not careful, those machines start to recalibrate our intuitive sense of danger and responsibility. We begin to imagine that real killers are meticulous like Morgan, that real evil announces itself with a monologue and a code, that someone like Manson must be secretly brilliant because the myth around him feels so large. But that is the distortion. Real crime scenes are chaotic, drug-fueled, panicked. Real followers talk, leave evidence, make mistakes. Real victims do not exist to complete a character arc. Recognizing that gap is part of our responsibility as viewers. We're going to enjoy the tension of Dexter, the way the series winds the line between his day job and his night work, without quietly importing its logic into how we think about actual people who orchestrate real deaths. Because the next step is simple and uncomfortable. Let's lay down one clear rule of thumb that you can use every time to tell when a story is asking for your empathy and when reality should be demanding your judgment instead. So here is that rule of thumb, stated as plainly as we can. Treat fictional killers as controlled thought experiments and real killers as evidence-based case studies. That is the line. On one side, you have stories that are built, tuned, and polished to explore an idea. On the other, you have people who left bodies, witnesses, and paperwork behind. When we apply this to Dexter, we are going to see how artificial, on purpose, his world really is. Dexter Morgan's code, the plastic, the ritual, the way every kill is framed as surgically clean, is not a handbook. It is a narrative device designed to let you watch him do the worst thing a person can do, while still following him through Miami Metro Homicide in the morning. The code is there so you can stay with him, not so you can learn from him. Think about his almost captures through that lens. Dokes cornering him by the cabin. La Guerta reopening the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation. Deborah standing on that dock in the final season, realizing who her brother really is. Each moment is calibrated, almost mathematically, to hold maximum suspense without snapping the story in half. He loses a blood slide here. He misjudges a tale there. But the line between exposure and escape is always drawn where the series needs it to be. You start to see how controlled it is when you lay them all out together. The algae evidence, the boat registry incoherent. When you treat him as a case study, you are forced to sit with that mess instead of smoothing it into a character arc. And this is where the separation matters. When you hold Dexter in the thought experiment box and Manson in the evidence box, you can still settle in, get comfortable, and enjoy the tension of Dexter almost getting caught at Miami Metro without quietly trivializing the very real horror of what Manson did. You can let one be a controlled story about a mask slipping, while the other remains what it actually was, a set of lives destroyed with no satisfying cut to credits. In the next section, we are going to take that rule and press on it a little harder by lining up specific near misses in Dexter's life against the specific, irreversible failures that finally ended Manson's. So when you lay them all out together, side by side, the near misses in Dexter's life and the hard, ugly facts of what Charles Manson did, the comparison folds in on itself. It is not just inaccurate, it quietly erases the line between crafted suspense and real suffering, between a room lit for a camera and a room that was never lit again because the people inside it died there. This is the story of two completely different kinds of control. Dexter Morgan moves through Miami, through metro homicide, with a code that is almost ritualistic. He wraps the room, selects the weapon, chooses the moment. Manson, by contrast, let chaos do most of his work. Drug-fueled nights at Spawn Ranch, confused followers, messy instructions that turned into messier crime scenes. One is a fiction about precision. The other is a record of confusion, fear, and irreversible damage. And when you trace how each one brushes up against consequences, you start to see the distance grow wider. Dexter is built on, almost caught, a drop of blood left on a boat, slides hidden in an air conditioner. LaGuerta, staring at a marina map that points straight at him. The tension is in the delay, in the way the mask holds for one more season. Manson's story does not have that luxury. Witness testimony, physical evidence, and the sheer brutality of the Tate LaBianca murders closed in and produced actual convictions, not cliffhangers. That difference matters because every time Dexter walks back into Miami Metro homicide the next morning, you are meant to feel the relief. The case is misdirected. The clue is missed. The code survives another night. But no one walked away from Cielo Drive with that feeling. There was no writer's room deciding who lived, who died, and who got one more scene to explain themselves. So yes,